Thank you, Cecilia. It's so wonderful to be here. It's always great. And thank you for this opportunity, and welcome everyone from wherever you are in the world. This short presentation of mine is just as a primer for the conversation. I'm going to do a quick whiz around the world of EdTech innovation and investment particularly. So just starting off as a reminder about whilst overall spending in education is growing, which is wonderful, and EdTech spending is growing, it's still fairly small as an overall proportion of spending. There's a long way to go, and we are expecting digital infrastructure catch up. We're seeing that already, particularly in mid/post-COVID. And then over time, we are expecting to see more sort of rise of new models, in particularly B2C models, and then some more enablers in terms of mobile and personal learning as time goes on. So short story is that EdTech spending is growing. It's still got a long way to go. Moving forward into what's happening with investment. And so I think this chart actually speaks volumes about what's happening in EdTech investment globally. You can see 2020 and 2021 up to Q3 only. So we're going to be looking around probably 18 to 20 billion US dollar of venture capital investment in EdTech in 2021. I mean, that is the record of records, essentially. But you'll see what's happening in the mix there. 2020 was massive for China, but those regulatory changes that have come through have really smashed any investment in EdTech in China, which was predominantly direct-to-consumer after-school tutoring models. And of course, regulatory changes there have just really smashed that. But what we're seeing here is the USA bouncing back like crazy, India as well, and Europe is also one of the fastest growing investment areas for EdTech, although smaller but fastest growing. So, you know, it's an amazing story in terms of where capital is flowing and capital you need in order to support innovation. Just zoning down a little bit into those geographies, so you can see that the sort of drop of investment in China. Investors in that country are now looking in other sectors, unfortunately. And what this story tells, though, is it's a real lesson or a warning, I guess, that education is really so important and embedded into society. It is the government regulation can make a massive difference to education one way or the other. And here's what we're seeing in China in terms of those regulatory changes. India is taking off, but look at the dollars, you know, it's $3.2 billion up until Q3 2021. Obviously a market to watch if you're not already. And, you know, the United States is also going gangbusters, but Europe is the fastest growing, as you can see from there. And I think Europe is just getting up to it was a bit under indexed, a bit underweight in the past. So it's great to see you know, investment moving in that direction. What's happening, where we are seeing a really high growth in direct to consumer models, not unusual in these type of situations where, you know, home learning over the last couple of years has been the norm. And so there's supplemental education is being funded a lot more. Just cutting back a little bit to where this money is going, where this capital is going, 50% is going into workforce upskilling and training type support. That proportion hasn't changed. It's been just under 50% for quite some time. But what we are seeing definitely over the last 2 years is a growth in investment, venture capital investment in K-12. And that is wonderful to see because those years of learning is so important. And you know, a further slice down on the right-hand side, you know, workforce and skills, as you can see, management systems, that's that sort of digital infrastructure catch-up we're talking about. And then digital content and STEAM and coding, this is one needs digital content if you are learning digitally, either blended or online. So we're seeing growth in those areas as well. But it's not the same story all around the world. It's context matters in education. And so, you know, in Asia, for example, K-12 is massive. Every single one of those circles you see is a funding round, and the size of the circle is the size of the round. And so, K-12 is massive and huge. Over the last 2 years, we are going to see a big change there because of this issue in China, that will shrink considerably over the next couple of years. Whereas, for example, in Europe, workforce is a much bigger story in terms of funding. And again, we're seeing a push towards or a more funding activity into K-12 in Europe as well as time goes on. I want to finish up with a couple of thematics before we start the conversation. So what we're seeing across EdTech investment is digital content is definitely increasingly being embedded into business as usual curriculum. Peripheral in the past, digital curriculum is now becoming much more central, and we're seeing schools and governments start to think a bit more long-term about digital curriculum as a foundation. Even if kids come back to school, which they will, kids will come back to school, but digital curriculum will stay. And so there's a bit of a tipping there. Particularly K-12 STEM education, the physical digital combinations is definitely growing. Workforce upskilling is, really does remain a very critical issue for governments. And so there's a lot of incentive for upskilling, in particular tech upskilling, but not only. The digital infrastructure catch-up is variable around the world, but certainly systems to support schools and institutions in their digital infrastructure, social emotional learning platforms, learning management systems, course creation platforms. There's a lot of activity in this space right now. As I mentioned before, the after-school tutoring market in China is in absolute free fall. It's a bit sad to see happen, but there's a really very big regulatory correction there, and that's something to watch. It's not limited to China. I think governments do make these decisions sort of every now and again, and so other markets are looking at that too. And the growth of attention to mental health and wellness solutions in K-12 and in higher education, and even in workforce, we're seeing lots of activity in terms of venture capital money growing into those areas as the world takes more attention to what's happening with people's mental health. And finally, we're seeing around the world a sort of strengthening and more work around the ethical applications of AI in education, or the approach to ethical AI. And, I think that is, very, very important and maybe overdue. And before technology can be really deeply embedded permanently into especially kids' learning processes, this issue has got to be tackled. And we see not only government, but also industry bodies and providers getting together to start building sort of frameworks around this. And so, I'm going to finish off here, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation. Let me stop sharing my screen, and we can jump into the conversation. So, Tricia, I know that you do a lot of work and have a lot of things to say about that last dot point of ethical AI. Do you want to jump in there? What are you seeing?
Definitely. We're seeing the same thing. The focus on AI, especially in the K-12 area of EdTech in particular, because so many of the families, the educators, the folks who are purchasing the EdTech tools don't even know that whether or not AI is being utilized. And so there's an increased push toward transparency, and not only that the EdTech product does indeed use AI, but how is AI embedded in the product? And then how is the data being trained in the first place? And so it's been really exciting to see quite a few organizations are focusing on whether it's product certifications for products to be able to really identify how they're utilizing it, how they're training their data sets, what they're doing with the data, where exactly the AI components are, and whether or not the users have any way to override the AI decisions, which is also really important. Making sure that the folks who are actually using it understand that in this scenario, this was the recommendation, But if the educator or the family believes it was not actually accurate, they can override that decision that was made by the AI. And so all of those are really important components that we're seeing become much more at the forefront of the conversations around the ethical use of AI. And so there's some pledges that are coming out. The AI EdTech Vendor Pledge is excellent. That came out of University of Pittsburgh through a work group that was organized and run by that, but it actually came out of circles. And then we also have some emerging areas around AI, mitigating racial bias in AI, which is really also very important to ensure that we really are serving the learners that we're intending to serve across the board. So that definitely is a space we also see.
Yeah, for sure. Just a follow-up question from me on that topic. I guess we see a lot of investment in EdTech, as you saw from those charts. It's growing enormously. Many EdTech companies and startups talk about using AI in their products and services. And I'm just interested in how many of them are, aware of the regulations, or whether they, it's both sides in terms of the user, whether it be the school or the parent and so on, but also it's also the EdTech and what support they can get to ensure that, their technology sort of ticks all the right boxes in terms of the things that you were talking about. How do you think that EdTechs can be supported in that? Are there opportunities for that, do you think?
I do. But we had so many conversations with EdTech companies, with the product developers, with the engineering teams when we were doing some research in creating pledges and product certifications and so forth. And one thing that we noticed is that the companies that had more cross-functional communication really had a deeper level of understanding on how the AI was actually being utilized, so they could speak to it. It was really interesting. We had some really interesting conversations. There were a couple of EdTech founders and developers who were actually talking about how it's become such a trend to say that you use AI in EdTech that some companies are just saying they're using it, but they actually are not. And then you also have the tools that look like they probably are utilizing AI. And so people are assuming they are, but they actually are not. And so bringing to the forefront whether or not it actually is being used, and specifically how, because the whole use of the term AI has become so expansive that we really need to focus in on what exactly do we mean when we say an EdTech product utilizes artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so forth. And then how is that actually being monitored along the way? So what we found is that through conversations with the developers, making sure that we have the engineers actually present in the conversations with the product managers and the development team, and more cross-functional communication really helps with that understanding.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's so, there's, like you said, there's a lot of EdTechs using or saying they're using artificial intelligence. I think that one of the things that we're seeing is the, it's cross-border. Like EdTech is not limited to the geography in which it was founded, and so curriculum is going cross borders more. EdTech is building markets all around the world, and the rules are different in terms of different geographies. And I think that's, I don't know whether it's an issue or whether it's a challenge or what, but I do see that the cross-border globalization, there are different rules forming and requirements and things like that. So I think one needs to be, if you're an EdTech and you're wanting to move globally and you're using AI or want to use AI, then you need to build into that plan and a real understanding of what the local requirements are. And I think that's quite tricky.
And to add on to what you were just saying, Maria, I also think that when I look at the data and then the deep analysis provided by Holland IQ, when I look at some of the acquisitions, you have acquisitions of global acquisitions of companies from other countries who now have this data generated by AI there may not be an awareness of how the original data sets were created or how the algorithms were created in the first place. And so a lot of that could be really interesting for global perspectives and global discussions. And it could actually be either an opportunity or a challenge in the future, but definitely something to pursue conversations around.
For sure, yeah. I mean, you know, the other thing that I'm really excited about in terms of EdTech funding and EdTech growth is that we're seeing those companies that started operation, you know, just a few years ago are really gaining traction. The thing that we're also seeing though is if there are EdTech that started in 2019 or 2020 or even late 2018 have found it a bit difficult to get traction through COVID. And so we're just watching how those younger companies gain traction and get support to grow when 2020 and 2021 have been so difficult, even though, you know, we're seeing the vast majority of EdTechs that were already established, that already had customers, really took off. But there is potentially a small gap there for the very young companies. And so we have to watch that going forward. And, you know, supports for EdTech, early stage EdTech is absolutely more important than ever.
It makes me wonder, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It makes me wonder if some of those younger companies who are successful are actually creating products that are really considering the entire learner. So one of your other thematics on the attention to mental health and wellness solutions, some of those solutions that actually incorporated not just content, but some of the social emotional learning components in the design and development of the product. It'd be interesting to see if some of the younger companies that are utilizing the whole child framework, so to speak, is that with the SEL embedded in the learning, may have more traction than those who are not.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the impact of COVID, you know, there's immediate impact of COVID, and then there's sort of short term, and then there's going to be long term. We don't know what that long term will be. We can guess. We know what the immediate impact was, but actually what I have seen, and it's really heartening to see, is some very solid teams building their support for teacher digital literacy, essentially, all around in different parts of the world. It's wonderful to see that, because the teacher is the one who can amplify learning for all the children that they that they impact. And so supporting the teachers in that, and there's some very interesting initiatives all around the world to do that. And so I think that's one of the, hopefully, upsides, longer term upsides, if you can call it that, of this situation.
Definitely. And another upside, in addition to the teachers, is the broader awareness on the part of the product developers of the importance of the family. And so I hear more and more conversations around data dashboards being really designed to be as family friendly as possible. So you normally would have a student dashboard and a teacher dashboard. There are more products that I'm hearing really focusing in on how they can provide a family dashboard that would be a parent dashboard, so to speak, that's really comprehensible, so that they can actually be more an active participant in the learning of their child. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Awesome. I think we're almost out of time. So Trish, it's been wonderful to have this conversation, and thank you again to Israel EdTech Week having us on the program, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the presentations.
Yes, thank you all. Fantastic.
Thank you.